Jacques de Molay is burning. The last Grand Master of the Knights Templar stands on an island in the Seine, surrounded by soldiers, priests, and a crowd that has come to watch a legend die. It is 1314. The order that once guarded pilgrims, moved king's money, and carried the cross into war has been broken. Its leaders have confessed, recanted, and been condemned. But beneath the smoke, one question refuses to disappear. Were the Templars destroyed because they had betrayed Christianity? Or because they knew too much about another version of it? To answer that, we have to move carefully. Not with the certainty of a courtroom, because the courtroom itself may have been poisoned. Not with the excitement of legend, because legends often arrive wearing someone else's face. We need to follow the evidence where it survives, and notice the places where it goes strangely quiet. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. The story of the Templars is not simply a tale of knights, treasure, and secret rites. It is a story about fear of hidden beliefs, fear of wealth beyond royal control, fear of men who answered to God, but not always to kings. Their enemies called them heretics. Later centuries called them guardians of forbidden mysteries. The truth may be less theatrical than either claim, but in some ways, more unsettling. Because sometimes the most dangerous secret is not a relic buried beneath a temple. Sometimes it is independence. Chapter 2. A holy order with an unholy reputation. The Knights Templar began with a promise that sounded almost impossible. Men of war would live like monks. In the early years after the First Crusade, Jerusalem was no longer only a city of scripture and memory. It was a place of checkpoints, armed patrols, fragile alliances, frightened travelers, and roads where devotion could get a pilgrim killed. Christians from Europe came east, believing they were walking toward the center of the sacred world. Many arrived poor, exhausted, and unprepared for how dangerous that journey could be after the great armies had gone home. Out of that unstable world came a small brotherhood of knights. Their stated purpose was simple and public: to protect pilgrims traveling through the Holy Land. They were not yet the vast institution that later frightened kings. They were not yet the subject of whispered accusations. At the beginning, the image was almost pure in its severity. Armed men taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, offering their swords in service of Christ. That idea had a strange power. A knight was expected to fight, to own weapons, to defend honor, to spill blood when required. A monk was expected to withdraw, to pray, to obey, to turn his life away from worldly ambition. The Templars fused those two callings into one body. To later eyes, that can feel contradictory. To the 12th century, it could feel like a solution. Here was violence placed under discipline. Here was warfare given a religious rule. Here were men who did not merely fight for land or lord, at least in theory, but for the defense of holy duty. And that, in theory, matters, because the Templars were born into a world where faith and power were not separate rooms. A religious order could own property. A military order could receive donations from nobles. A brotherhood could become a bank before anyone comfortably used that word in the modern sense. Good intentions did not prevent influence. Sacred vows did not prevent ambition. In medieval Europe, holiness could become a kind of political technology. The Templars understood this better than most. Their white mantles marked them as men set apart. The red cross stitched onto that cloth announced both devotion and combat. They were meant to be recognizable, disciplined, obedient to their own rule, and answerable in a special way to the Church. Over time, papal privileges helped protect them from many local authorities. They collected estates, managed farms, held fortresses, moved money, and built a network that stretched across kingdoms. To supporters, this was the necessary machinery of a holy mission. Pilgrims did not protect themselves with poetry. Castles did not maintain themselves with good intentions. Horses, armor, ships, grain, and garrisons all cost money. If the Templars became wealthy, their defenders could argue that wealth was not private luxury but institutional fuel. Still, it is not hard to see why the reputation darkened. A poor knight, individually, might own little. The order, collectively, owned a great deal. That distinction may satisfy a theologian, but it rarely satisfies a jealous noble or an indebted king. The Templars could appear humble and untouchable at the same time, and that is a dangerous combination. They presented themselves as servants of Christ, yet operated with a level of autonomy that made secular rulers uncomfortable. They were monks, but not cloistered. They were soldiers, but not entirely under royal command. They were religious, but not quite ordinary clergy. They occupied a category that made sense on parchment and caused unease in practice. Their secrecy added another layer. Every religious order had internal rules. Every institution had spaces outsiders did not enter. But the Templars closed ceremonies, initiation rites, and internal discipline became unusually easy to imagine in darker terms. Outsiders could see the crosses, the horses, the fortified houses, the accounts, the processions. They could not see everything that happened when a new brother was received into the order, or when senior members corrected one another behind closed doors. The gap between what is visible and what is hidden is where suspicion breeds. In a more trusting society, hidden rites might be accepted as sacred privacy. In a society shaped by crusade, heresy scares, political rivalry, and apocalyptic expectation, secrecy could look like concealment. If a group of armed monks bowed their heads in private, were they praying, testing loyalty, preserving discipline, or teaching something no bishop would approve? The evidence for the darkest version would come much later, under conditions that make it difficult to trust. But the atmosphere that made such accusations believable was created over generations. The Templars also carried the burden of success. At first, their mission was easy to understand: defend pilgrims and support the Crusader presence in the East. But as decades passed, the crusading world became more complicated. Military victories turned into fragile holdings. Fragile holdings became losses. The Holy Land was not a stage where Christian armies simply advanced under divine favor. It was a contested political landscape, full of truces, negotiations, defeats, and compromises that could look ugly from a distance. The military orders, including the Templars, had to live inside that reality. They dealt with local conditions. They made strategic decisions. They sometimes supported policies that other Christians criticized. A knight on the frontier might understand a compromise as survival. A preacher in Europe might call it weakness. A royal court might see not piety, but an armed corporation with its own interests. This is one of the most important things to remember about their reputation. It was not created in a single moment. It accumulated. A donation here, a privilege there, a locked door, a rumored arrogance, a failed campaign, a debt unpaid by someone powerful, a ritual seen only in fragments, a brother who left angry, a king who needed money, a public that knew the order was rich, but did not understand the machinery behind that wealth. Reputation is often built from facts, half-facts, misunderstandings, and resentments pressed together until they become something harder than proof. By the time the Templars were accused of blasphemy and hidden corruption, they already seemed unusual enough for the accusations to stick in the public imagination, not necessarily because they were true, but because the order had become the kind of institution people were ready to believe strange things about. That is the uneasy foundation of the entire mystery. A simple holy order would have been harder to turn into a monster. A purely corrupt order would have left less room for debate. The Templars were neither simple nor obviously monstrous. They were disciplined and wealthy, pious and political, admired and resented. They were built to serve a sacred war, yet they survived long enough to become entangled with finance, diplomacy, and royal anxiety. Their unholy reputation did not come from one secret alone. It came from the tension at the heart of their identity. They claimed to be poor, yet held vast resources. They claimed obedience, yet enjoyed unusual independence. They claimed humility, yet stood armed before kings. They claimed devotion to Christ, yet later stood accused of denying him in the most intimate rituals of their order. And once those contradictions were placed before a frightened public, the question no longer sounded absurd. What were these men really guarding? Chapter 3. The Temple Mount and the Birth of the Legend. The name itself was never neutral. Knights Templar, poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Even before the accusations, before the trials, before the legends grew teeth, the order carried a word that pulled the imagination backward through centuries. Temple. Not merely a church, not merely a fortress. The temple. In Jerusalem, names have weight. They do not sit quietly on maps. They gather scripture, conquest, mourning, prophecy, and argument around them. A hill is not just a hill. A wall is not just a wall. A stone platform can become a battlefield of memory. The early Templars were associated with the area of the Temple Mount, a place already dense with sacred meaning. For Jews, it was bound to the memory of the ancient temple. For Christians, it stood within the geography of biblical history and apocalyptic expectation. For Muslims, it was and remains one of the holiest places in Islam. By the time Crusaders entered Jerusalem, the site was not an empty stage waiting for Europeans to discover its significance. It was already layered with devotion and loss. That is part of what later legend often forgets. The Templars did not arrive in a forgotten city and stumble into a secret no one else had imagined. Jerusalem had been studied, prayed over, conquered, rebuilt, and interpreted long before them. The idea that a handful of knights simply dug beneath the holy city and uncovered the hidden machinery of Christianity belongs more to modern storytelling than to secure medieval evidence. And yet, it is easy to understand why the legend grew. The order's early home near this sacred ground created the perfect conditions for suspicion. Here were armed monks, living at the symbolic center of biblical history, in a place associated with Solomon, sacrifice, divine presence, and lost sacred objects. They were not ordinary pilgrims passing through. They stayed. They organized. They gained privileges. They became guardians of roads and holders of strategic property. To later imaginations, that physical proximity began to look like access. Access to what? That is where history gives way to possibility, and possibility gives way to myth. Some later traditions imagined the Templars discovering relics beneath the Temple Mount, the Ark of the Covenant, fragments of the true cross, sacred vessels, ancient scrolls, or hidden teachings too dangerous for the public church. Others went further, suggesting they found evidence of a different Christianity, one that had survived beneath official doctrine like an underground stream. The evidence for such discoveries is thin. Often, it is not evidence in the strict sense at all, but a chain of associations. The Templars were near the temple. The temple was ancient. Ancient places hide things. Powerful men keep secrets. Therefore, the Templars must have found something. It is a tempting chain because each link feels plausible enough in isolation. But plausibility is not proof. A good mystery can begin with geography. It cannot end there. Still, the geography mattered. The Temple Mount gave the Templars a symbolic identity unlike any other military order. The Hospitallers could be associated with care for the sick and pilgrims. The Teutonic Knights would later carry their own hard northern reputation, but the Templars were tied, by name and origin, to the most charged sacred architecture in the Western religious imagination. Even people who knew little about their finances or military campaigns could understand that this order had been born in the shadow of something immense. That symbolic power followed them home. Across Europe, Templar churches and commanderies were not simply administrative outposts. They were reminders that these men belonged to an international order rooted in the Holy Land. A village might never see Jerusalem, but it might see Templar lands, Templar brothers, Templar processions, Templar seals. The order became a kind of living bridge between local society and a sacred battlefield far away. For admirers, that bridge was inspiring. For critics, it was unsettling. Why did these men have so many privileges? Why did their wealth flow across borders? Why did they answer to authorities beyond the local lord? A rumor does not need full knowledge to survive. In fact, lack of knowledge often strengthens it. Most people did not know the inner workings of the order. They knew the image: white mantles, red crosses, holy war, Eastern origins, wealth, secrecy. The imagination supplied the rest. And because the Templars had once lived near the Temple of Solomon, the rest could become almost anything. This is where the birth of the legend becomes more interesting than the legend itself. The question is not only whether the Templars found a hidden relic or forbidden gospel. It is why later generations needed them to have found one. Why did the Templars become the chosen vessel for these stories, rather than some other order, monastery, or noble family? The answer lies in their contradictions. They were religious, but armed, poor in vow, but rich in institution, publicly Christian, but privately governed, born in Jerusalem, but spread across Europe, destroyed by accusation, yet never fully explained. That last point is crucial. A clean ending kills legend. An unresolved destruction feeds it. When Jacques de Molay died in the fire, he did not take a documented treasure map with him. He did not publicly reveal a hidden gospel. He did not, as far as reliable evidence shows, confess to guarding a secret church beneath the church. But his death left behind an emotional shape that legend could occupy. A powerful order crushed, its records scattered, its leaders silenced. its reputation blackened by enemies who had reasons to lie. Into that space, later centuries placed the Temple Mount. If the Templars had been corrupt, perhaps their fall was deserved. If they had been innocent, perhaps they were victims of greed. But if they had discovered something in Jerusalem, something that threatened the religious or political order of Europe, then their destruction became part of a far grander drama. Suddenly, the trial was not only about blasphemous initiation rites or royal debt. It was about suppressed truth. That is a seductive idea. It gives meaning to brutality. It makes political violence feel metaphysical. It turns legal documents into clues, ruins into locks, and silence into evidence. But careful history asks us to slow down. The Templars did occupy a world where sacred objects mattered deeply. Relics could draw pilgrims, strengthen claims, and carry enormous spiritual prestige. Medieval people did not treat holy objects as decorative curiosities. They could anchor identity, sanctify power, and inspire real devotion. So it is not absurd that the Templars valued sacred places or that stories of relics clustered around them. What remains uncertain is whether any hidden discovery changed their theology or placed them in possession of forbidden Christian traditions. The more grounded possibility is subtler. Jerusalem changed them not because they found one secret object, but because they became an order formed at the intersection of sacred geography, warfare, money, and myth. Their identity was forged in a place where every stone seemed to point beyond itself. That kind of origin does not need an actual buried gospel to become dangerous in memory. It is enough that people believed such a thing could have been buried there. The Temple Mount gave the Templars more than a headquarters. It gave them a mythic address. And once an institution has that, ordinary explanations begin to feel too small. Debts, politics, failed crusades, rivalries, and papal pressure may explain much of what happened to them. But for many listeners across the centuries, those explanations have never satisfied the deeper hunger. They want the fall of the Templars to reveal a hidden center. They want the fire in Paris to lead back to the stones of Jerusalem. Perhaps that is why the legend has endured. The Templars stood close enough to sacred mystery for later generations to imagine they had touched it. They were secretive enough to make denial unconvincing to those already inclined to suspect them. And they were destroyed violently enough to make every missing answer look intentional. No proven forbidden Christianity has been lifted from beneath the Temple Mount and placed in their hands. But the legend did not require proof to begin. It required a name, a place, and an order whose real history was already strange enough that invention could attach itself without looking entirely out of place. Chapter 4. The religion they were accused of hiding. To understand the accusation, we have to step away from treasure for a moment. Not because treasure is unimportant to the Templar legend. It matters, but it often distracts from the more dangerous idea. Medieval authorities were not mainly frightened by a chest of gold, or a jeweled cup, or a relic hidden behind a wall. Those things could be seized, displayed, renamed, folded back into the official world. A relic could be claimed by a king. A treasury could be transferred to another order. A fortress could be occupied. A different Christianity was harder to capture. In the Middle Ages, heresy was not treated as a private opinion. It was not simply a person quietly disagreeing with a sermon and going home for dinner. To church authorities, heresy threatened the unity of salvation itself. To rulers, it could threaten obedience, law, inheritance, taxation, military loyalty, and the entire arrangement by which society explained its own hierarchy. Belief was not sealed inside the mind. It shaped public order. This is why accusations of hidden religion carried such force. When people later spoke of forbidden Christianity, they were not always imagining the same thing. Sometimes they meant secret gospels or suppressed teachings from the earliest centuries of the Church. Sometimes they meant mystical interpretations of Christ that avoided ordinary clergy. Sometimes they meant dualist movements that saw the material world itself as corrupt, or at least spiritually compromised. Sometimes the phrase simply became a container for everything official religion feared but could not fully erase. The Templars were pulled into that container after their fall. The most important medieval background here is the long fear of heresy, especially in southern France and surrounding regions where dissenting religious movements had taken root. Among the most famous were the Cathars, also known in many sources as Albigensians. Their beliefs varied across time and place, and medieval reports about them were often written by opponents, so caution is necessary. But broadly speaking, they were associated with a severe spiritual dualism, a sharp conflict between the realm of spirit and the corruption of the material world. That kind of belief struck at the heart of ordinary Christian life. If the material world was deeply corrupted, what did that mean for the sacraments, for the authority of priests, for marriage, for oaths, for the body, for the church as an earthly institution with land, money, courts, and bishops? A movement that seemed to reject or undermine those things was not merely alternative. It could look like a rival universe. The church responded with preaching, investigation, condemnation, and eventually violence. The Albigensian Crusade in the early 13th century left a deep wound in the religious memory of southern France. Heresy was not an abstract category there. It had been hunted. Families had been divided. Noble houses had been pressured or destroyed. Local resentment could survive long after open dissent had been driven underground. This is the world into which later suspicion of the Templars would be poured. But we need to be precise. There is no clean, reliable proof that the Knights Templar, as an order-protected Cathar theology, preserved a dualist church, or secretly maintained a formal forbidden Christianity behind their official devotion to Christ. That claim belongs more to later speculation than to solid medieval evidence. It is possible to find overlaps of geography, family connection, resentment, and rumor. It is much harder to turn those overlaps into a doctrine. This distinction matters because legends often work by proximity. The Templars had houses in regions touched by heresy. Some noble families who interacted with the order may also have had complicated relationships with dissent, anti-clerical feeling, or memories of persecution. The order had its own closed rites and unusual privileges. Later, when the Templars were accused of denying Christ and corrupting sacred symbols, people could connect those accusations to the older fear of hidden heresy. The result was powerful, but not necessarily accurate. It is one thing to say the Templars lived in a world haunted by forbidden religion. That is true. It is another thing to say they were the guardians of such a religion. That remains unproven. The trial accusations did not present a sophisticated Cathar theology. They did not reveal a careful alternative gospel, a coherent dualist creed, or a hidden scripture preserved by the order. What emerged instead was stranger and more chaotic. Claims of obscene initiation gestures, denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, secret idols, improper kisses, and instructions that varied from testimony to testimony. The charges sounded horrifying, but they did not always sound theologically organized. That may tell us something. If the Templars had been protecting a fully developed forbidden Christianity, we might expect the accusations to reveal clearer doctrines. Instead, much of what appears in the record resembles a collection of anti-heretical nightmares, inversion of sacred symbols, betrayal of Christ, sexualized humiliation, idolatry, secrecy, and contamination. These were the kinds of images medieval authorities already associated with hidden corruption. They were not neutral observations. They were accusation-shaped. And accusation has a language of its own. A society tells you what it fears by the stories it finds believable. When authorities described heretics, they often imagined secret gatherings, distorted rituals, blasphemy, sexual disorder, and contempt for the cross. Whether those descriptions were accurate in each case is another matter. The pattern itself became familiar. Once a group was marked as suspect, old images could be applied to new targets. The Templars were an unusually attractive target for that language because their real practices already had private elements. Initiation into a religious order was not public entertainment. Internal discipline was not open to every village gossip. Brothers obeyed superiors. They had rituals of reception, confession, correction, and command. These might have been ordinary within the religious culture of the time, but secrecy made them vulnerable to reinterpretation. A rough gesture used as a test of obedience could later be described as blasphemy. A symbolic act of humility could be made to sound obscene. A harsh internal ceremony could become proof of hidden religion. And under interrogation, especially when pain and fear entered the room, memory itself could become a tool in someone else's hand. This does not mean every accusation was invented from nothing. A careful reading should leave room for the possibility that some Templar houses practiced rough, irregular, or abusive initiation customs. Institutions can develop local habits that official rules never admit. A brother may be told to do something shocking as a test, not because the order has rejected Christianity, but because obedience itself has become theater. That would still matter. It would still be spiritually ugly, but it would not automatically prove a secret church. The difference between corruption and heresy is important. Corruption means an institution has betrayed its ideals. Heresy means it has adopted a different religious truth. The trial of the Templars blurred that line. Once the order was accused of denying Christ, every failure of discipline could be made to serve a larger story. Financial power became suspicious. Secrecy became evidence. Arrogance became spiritual rebellion. The order's odd position in society made the leap easier. This is where forbidden Christianity becomes less a single hidden doctrine and more a medieval anxiety. The fear was not only that the Templars had read the wrong book, it was that they had become a closed religious world inside the Christian world, with their own loyalties, their own ceremonies, their own wealth, and their own ability to move across borders. In an age already scarred by heresy, that was enough to make imagination dangerous. The Cathars and other dissenters supplied the background music. The Templars supplied the locked door. Philip IV and his ministers would later supply the accusation. Whether something truly heretical waited behind that door is much harder to say. What we can say with more confidence is that the idea of forbidden Christianity did not attach itself to the Templars by accident. It grew from a century of fear, war, persecution, secrecy, and mistrust. The order did not need to be Cathar to be suspected in a Cathar-haunted world. It did not need to guard a hidden gospel to become a symbol of hidden belief. Sometimes history does not require a secret doctrine. Sometimes it requires only a society already trained to fear one. Chapter 5. Southern France. The Shadow Zone. Southern France did not invent the Templar mystery, but it gave the mystery a landscape where it could breathe. The region often called the Languedoc was not a single simple thing. It was a world of fortified towns, old noble families, local loyalties, trade routes, churchmen, poets, ruined ambitions, and memories that did not disappear just because official records declared a conflict finished. Power there had its own texture. It did not always feel like the cleaner, more centralized authority imagined by kings in Paris or popes in Rome. That difference mattered. To understand why the Templars became so easy to suspect, we have to remember that medieval Europe was not one uniform Christian society with identical habits everywhere. It was a patchwork of jurisdictions, languages, privileges, rivalries, and local customs. A commandery in one region did not exist in the same social atmosphere as a commandery somewhere else. Land could carry memory. Families could carry resentment. A road could connect not just markets, but ideas. In the south of France, the atmosphere had been shaped by the struggle against heresy, especially the repression of Catharism and the violence that followed. Even after open resistance was crushed, the memory of that world remained. Some families had lost land or status. Some communities had learned caution. Some people had watched outside authorities arrive in the name of religious purity and leave behind a new political order. It is not hard to see how suspicion could survive there. The Templars held property in this broader region, as they did in many parts of Europe. They managed estates, received donations, interacted with local nobles, and stood slightly apart from ordinary civic and ecclesiastical life. Their houses were not secret castles of forbidden doctrine, at least not according to reliable evidence. But they were enclosed communities with their own hierarchy and purpose. They had enough visibility to be noticed and enough privacy to be imagined. That is a dangerous balance. A Templar house could be part of the everyday landscape and still feel unreachable. People might pass its lands, know its brothers, hear of its wealth, or depend on its economic activity. But the inner life of the order remained inside. The brothers did not explain themselves to every neighbor. Their authority came from outside the region as much as from within it. Their loyalty was international, not purely local. In a place where memory already distrusted distant power that made them both useful and suspicious, southern France becomes important, not because it proves the Templars were heretics, but because it shows how rumor can grow in soil already disturbed. A region does not need to be guilty of anything to become a shadow zone. It only needs overlapping fears. Here there were memories of suppressed dissent. There were noble networks with complicated histories. There was anti-clerical feeling in some quarters, not necessarily atheism or disbelief, but resentment toward church wealth, church courts, and clerical intrusion. There were military orders with land and privileges. There were royal ambitions pushing into older local worlds. When those forces overlap, the line between fact and interpretation becomes thin. A noble family that had once shown sympathy to dissenters might also donate to the Templars. Does that mean the Templars protected heresy? Not by itself. A local lord could give land for many reasons: piety, prestige, politics, fear, gratitude, family strategy, or the hope of spiritual benefit. Medieval donations were rarely simple windows into private belief. They were social acts as much as religious ones. A Templar brother from a troubled region might have relatives touched by older accusations. Does that make the order suspect? Again, not necessarily. People entered institutions from the worlds they knew. A man's family background did not automatically define the doctrine of the order he joined. But to an investigator looking for hidden corruption, such connections could be made to look meaningful. This is one of the great hazards in the Templar story. Patterns can be real without proving the thing people want them to prove. There really were Templar holdings in regions marked by religious conflict. There really were local memories of heresy. There really were networks of nobles and landowners whose histories were not cleanly divided into loyal and disloyal, orthodox and heretical. But the leap from overlap to conspiracy is a long one. Later legend often crosses it in a single step. History has to walk. The appeal of southern France in the Templar legend is that it seems to offer atmosphere as evidence. The ruined castles, the stories of persecuted believers, the distance from northern royal authority, the sense of an older, more independent culture resisting outside control. It is all evocative. It feels like a place where a hidden tradition could survive. And perhaps some hidden memories did survive there. Families remember what courts forget. Local songs and private loyalties can preserve bitterness long after official victory. But memory is not the same as doctrine. And sympathy is not the same as organized protection. The Templars may have moved through this world as practical men, not secret theologians. They needed land, revenue, horses, storage, recruits, and influence. They dealt with whoever mattered locally. They did what large institutions do. They embedded themselves. That embedding could later be misread as ideological alliance. It may sometimes have been alliance of convenience. It may sometimes have been friendship. It may sometimes have been nothing more than paperwork and property. Still, the suspicion attached because the order's structure made it hard to dismiss completely. Unlike a village priest, the Templars did not belong entirely to one place. Unlike a noble family, they could not be reduced to bloodline and inheritance. Unlike ordinary monks, they were armed. Unlike ordinary soldiers, they were vowed religious men. Their houses formed a network that crossed boundaries. In a region where old beliefs had been chased into hiding, an international religious military network could look, to hostile eyes, like a perfect hiding place. That perception may explain more than any proven secret. The Languedoc becomes a mirror in the story. People look into it and see what they already believe about the Templars. If they believe the order was innocent, the region shows how political violence and anti-heretical paranoia could taint reputations. If they believe the order was guilty, the region becomes a map of hidden connections. If they prefer romance, it becomes the borderland where lost Christianity escaped destruction. The actual evidence is less obedient. It does not neatly confirm the legend. It does not erase every question either. What it gives us is a social world in which accusation could feel plausible. And plausibility, in moments of crisis, can be almost as dangerous as proof. By the early 14th century, the Templars had become vulnerable not only because of what they did, but because of where they stood. They stood near the memory of crusade, near the memory of heresy, near noble resentment, near royal debt, near sacred symbols, near closed rituals, near too many things that frightened powerful men. Southern France was not the secret church itself. It was the place where all the shadows met. Chapter 6. The Secret Initiation. The most damaging accusations against the Templars did not begin on a battlefield. They began at the threshold. A man entered the order. He stood before brothers who had already crossed the line he was about to cross. He was no longer simply a knight, a younger son, a penitent, an adventurer, or a man looking for salvation with a sword in his hand. He was becoming part of a closed body, one with its own vows, discipline, hierarchy, and memory. Initiation always carries power. It separates the outside from the inside. It tells the new member that ordinary life has ended and another kind of obedience has begun. In a monastery, that might be solemn and beautiful. In a military order, it could also be severe. A man who entered the Templars was not joining a debating society. He was binding himself to a dangerous life, one in which command mattered, secrecy mattered, and personal will had to bend. That is the reasonable background. Then come the accusations. When the Templars were arrested and interrogated, some brothers described ceremonies that sounded like a deliberate reversal of Christianity. New initiates were allegedly ordered to deny Christ. They were told to spit on the cross or near it. They received kisses that later testimony described as obscene or humiliating. Some claimed they were instructed that certain sexual acts among brothers were permitted, or at least not sinful. Others spoke of hidden commands, forbidden gestures, and rituals that seemed designed to break the initiate before remaking him. To medieval ears, this was not merely scandalous, it was spiritual treason. The cross was not a decorative emblem. For a military order whose very identity rested on fighting under the sign of Christ, spitting on the cross was an image of almost perfect betrayal. Denying Christ at this moment of entrance into a Christian order made the ceremony sound like an anti-baptism, a dark mirror of conversion. The obscene kisses added another layer, the idea that sacred brotherhood had been twisted into degradation. It is easy to see why these claims were effective. They were vivid. They were repeatable. They could be summarized quickly. A king did not need to explain complicated financial tensions or papal jurisdiction to a nervous public. He could say, "These men denied Christ in secret." Once that idea entered the air, the Templars' white mantles no longer looked pure. They looked like costumes. But this is where the story becomes difficult. The accusations were recorded in an atmosphere of fear, imprisonment, and in many cases, torture or the threat of torture. Confessions produced under pain are not worthless, but they are dangerous evidence. They tell us something happened in the interrogation room. They do not always tell us what happened in the initiation chamber. A man under torture may confess to what his interrogators expect. He may repeat phrases he has heard from others. He may accept a suggested detail because denial has become unbearable. He may speak partly from memory, partly from terror, partly from confusion. And once a pattern of accusation exists, later testimony can begin to conform to it. The story becomes a mold. Yet it would also be too simple to dismiss every troubling statement as pure invention. Some testimony came from brothers who admitted elements of the rites while trying to soften their meaning. Some described being told to deny Christ only with the mouth, not the heart. Others suggested the acts were performed as tests of obedience, not expressions of doctrine. That distinction may sound convenient, and perhaps sometimes it was, but it is also psychologically plausible. Institutions built on obedience can create rituals that outsiders find monstrous and insiders treat as symbolic. A recruit might be forced to perform a shocking act to prove that he will submit to command. The purpose may not be theological rebellion. It may be humiliation, discipline, secrecy, or the crushing of personal pride. None of that makes it harmless. A ritual does not need to be heretical in doctrine to be spiritually corrupt in practice. A Christian order could betray Christian values without adopting a rival Christianity. This is one of the central ambiguities. Were these ceremonies real? In some form, perhaps. Were they uniform across the entire order? The evidence is far less clear. Did they mean the Templars secretly rejected Christ? That is harder still. A scattered, abusive, unofficial custom is not the same as an organized, hidden religion. A coerced gesture is not the same as belief. A ritual of obedience, if that is what it was, may reveal institutional sickness rather than secret theology. The variation in testimony matters. If every Templar across Europe had described the same ceremony in precise detail, the case would look different. Instead, the accounts shift. Some brothers denied the accusations. Some confessed and later recanted. Some admitted one element, but not another. The location of the kisses changed. The wording of the denial changed. The meaning of the acts changed. The very unevenness of the record makes interpretation difficult. This unevenness can be read two ways. Defenders of the order can say the inconsistencies reveal a prosecution manufacturing crimes from fear and suggestion. Critics can answer that secret rites often vary from house to house, especially in a large medieval institution spread across regions. Both points deserve consideration. The evidence does not offer the comfort of simplicity. What it does offer is a glimpse into how power works when secrecy meets accusation. Because the Templars had private initiations, their enemies could imagine almost anything inside them. Because some brothers may have experienced strange or harsh customs, interrogators had material to distort. Because torture was used, truth and falsehood could be fused under pressure. Because the order had wealth and independence, the worst interpretations served powerful interests. The secret initiation became the perfect battlefield. Not a battlefield of armies, but of meaning. If the rite was orthodox and solemn, the Templars were victims of a grotesque smear. If it included humiliating tests but no doctrinal rejection, they were guilty of corruption, not necessarily heresy. If it truly required denial of Christ as a core practice, then the order's public identity was a mask. The entire trial turned on which interpretation one chose to believe. And the tragedy is that the conditions of the trial made certainty almost unreachable. The initiation accusations also explain why the Templar legend survived so well. People can forget legal procedures. They rarely forget a symbol violated. A cross spat upon is an image that travels easily through centuries. It does not require footnotes. It enters the imagination immediately, and once it is there, every other suspicion grows around it. This is why the accusation was more destructive than a charge of greed. Greed is ordinary. Many institutions are greedy. But a secret ceremony of denial suggests an inner world opposite to the outer one. It tells the public that everything visible was false. The prayers, the Red Cross, the vows, the defense of pilgrims, the martyr-like discipline. It turns reputation inside out, whether that inversion reflects truth, distortion, or a confession shaped by pain remains disputed. What can be said more carefully is that the Templar initiation became the place where all fears about the order gathered. Fear of secrecy, fear of obedience, fear of hidden heresy, fear of elite brotherhoods beyond ordinary control, fear that holiness itself could be staged, and perhaps that is why the accusations still disturb. They do not simply ask whether a few men performed a forbidden gesture behind closed doors. They ask how much of an institution can be hidden from the world while still asking the world to trust it. For the Templars, that question proved fatal. Chapter 7. Baphomet and the Head in the Dark. Among all the charges brought against the Templars, one accusation had a special power because it refused to become clear. A denial of Christ could be imagined. A cross spat upon could be pictured. An obscene kiss, however scandalous, still belonged to the human body. But an idol in the darkness, a head, a face, a strange name spoken by frightened men, that belonged to another realm of fear altogether. The trial records contain claims that some Templars worshipped or revered a mysterious figure. Sometimes it was described as a head, sometimes as a face, sometimes as an object with a beard. In some accounts, it seemed to have magical properties. It could make the order wealthy. It could make trees flower. It could protect the brothers. Other testimony was vaguer, as if the witness were reaching through smoke for something he had been told to remember. And then there was the name. Baphomet. Few words in the Templar story have traveled farther from their original setting. Today, Baphomet is often imagined as a horned occult figure, part goat, part human, seated in a posture of dreadful balance. But that image is not what the medieval Templar trial clearly gives us. Much of the familiar modern image belongs to later occult imagination, especially the 19th century, long after the order had been destroyed. In the early 14th century accusations, Baphomet was not yet the creature on a poster, a tattoo, or a heavy metal album cover. It was a strange word appearing in a legal and religious crisis, attached to testimony that was inconsistent, pressured, and often difficult to interpret. Some historians have suggested the name may have been a distorted form of Muhammad, a medieval Christian rendering of Muhammad, used in a period when Christians often misunderstood Islam and accused their enemies of idol worship. That possibility does not solve the mystery, but it does remind us that medieval accusation had its own vocabulary. To accuse someone of worshiping an idol was to place them outside the safe boundaries of Christian society. It did not merely say they had made a mistake. It said they had inverted devotion. They had bowed where no Christian should bow. In a crusading culture, the charge carried an additional sting. The Templars had fought in the East against Muslim powers. If they could be portrayed as secretly honoring a figure associated, however inaccurately, with Islam, then their whole identity collapsed into betrayal. This may have been the point. The accusation did not need to be theologically precise to be useful. In fact, vagueness may have made it stronger. A clearly described idol can be examined, denied, or compared with other evidence. A shifting idol can grow. A head seen by one brother, heard of by another, never seen by a third, but feared by all. That kind of object becomes almost impossible to contain. The mysterious head is worth pausing over. Medieval Christianity had many legitimate sacred heads. Reliquaries shaped like heads were used to preserve the skulls or remains of saints. Churches displayed holy objects with elaborate decoration. A head-shaped vessel, in itself, would not have been automatically demonic. It might have been a relic container, a devotional object, or something quite ordinary within the religious culture of the time. This is where interpretation becomes treacherous. If a Templar house possessed a head-shaped reliquary, an unfriendly investigator could make it sound like an idol. If a brother had seen an object briefly, in poor understanding, he might describe it in confused terms. If interrogators already expected idolatry, they could press witnesses toward that shape. And if there was no object at all, the rumor of one could still move from mouth to mouth because it served the larger story being built around the order. There are several possibilities, and none should be handled too casually. The first is that some Templars really did possess unusual devotional objects that outsiders misunderstood. The second is that certain local houses developed strange internal customs around objects now lost or unidentified. The third is that the accusation was largely constructed from older anti-heretical and anti-Muslim stereotypes. The fourth is that torture and fear turned fragments of memory into something monstrous. These possibilities are not equally provable, but they show why the charge has lasted. A mysterious head is better for legend than a complete answer. It has a face but not a biography. It has a name but not a stable meaning. It appears in testimony but not with enough clarity to become ordinary. That is why later writers could fill it with whatever their own century desired. Secret wisdom, pagan survival, satanic worship, Gnostic teaching, the severed head of a saint, the head of Christ, the head of John the Baptist, a symbol of forbidden knowledge. Each theory tells us as much about the imagination of the theorist as about the Templars. The most careful approach is less satisfying, but more honest. The trial evidence does not prove that the Templars worshipped Baphomet as later occult tradition imagined it. It does show that their enemies, and perhaps some frightened or broken members of the order, described a hidden object or figure in ways that suggested idolatry. The language was powerful because it touched several medieval fears at once: heresy, Islam, magic, secrecy, and the corruption of sacred ritual. That combination was devastating. By itself, a head in a box might be explainable. A strange name might be a misunderstanding. A rumor of magical powers might be dismissed as fantasy. But when placed beside accusations of denying Christ and spitting on the cross, the head became part of a pattern. The prosecution could say, "Look, this was not one bad custom. This was a secret religion." And yet the pattern may have been assembled after the decision to destroy them had already been made. That is the uncomfortable possibility. Evidence can reveal guilt, but evidence can also be arranged to make guilt visible where power already wants to see it. The Templar trial asks us to consider not only what was said, but who benefited from the saying. Baphomet survived because it was never fully explained. The name became a vessel for later fear, rebellion, and fascination. It allowed people to imagine the Templars not merely as failed crusaders or victims of royal greed, but as keepers of something older, stranger, and deliberately hidden. In that sense, Baphomet became less an object from the past than a mirror held up to centuries of suspicion. The real danger of the accusation was not that it proved too much. It proved too little and suggested everything. A clear idol could have been destroyed. A clear doctrine could have been condemned. A clear fraud could have been exposed. But a half-seen head, named in broken testimony, kept changing shape. It moved from interrogation chambers into folklore, from folklore into occult symbolism, from occult symbolism into modern culture, becoming more famous than most of the men who testified about it. and perhaps that is fitting. The Templars were condemned in part by things hidden from public view. Their reputation was ruined by ceremonies few outsiders had seen, words allegedly spoken in secret, objects described without certainty. Baphomet is the purest form of that problem, a symbol born from unclear evidence, sharpened by fear, and made immortal by not being understood. The head in the dark may not tell us what the Templars believed. It tells us what their world was ready to believe about them. Chapter 8. Philip the Fair's perfect enemy. At some point, the mystery leaves the chapel and enters the treasury. That does not make it less dramatic. In some ways, it makes it more dangerous. A secret idol can frighten a crowd, but debt can move a kingdom. A rumor can stain a reputation, but royal necessity can turn that stain into a weapon. The man standing at the center of this shift is Philip IV of France, remembered as Philip the Fair. The name can mislead modern ears. Fair did not mean gentle. It referred to appearance, not temperament. Philip's reign was marked by a cold, relentless concern for royal authority. He was not the sort of king who liked powerful institutions operating beside him, across him, or above him. His France was becoming more centralized, more administrative, more demanding. The crown needed money, obedience, and control. The Templars had all three in forms Philip could not easily command. They were wealthy, but not simply as a rich noble was wealthy. Their resources belonged to an order with international reach. They had estates, revenues, fortified properties, and financial expertise. They could move funds, they could lend, they could store. They could manage wealth in a way that made them useful to rulers and, eventually, threatening to them. They were obedient, but not primarily to the French king. Their highest loyalties ran through their own hierarchy and the church. They were a religious order with privileges that placed them partly outside normal local control. That did not mean they were lawless. It meant they were awkward. And to a monarch trying to tighten his grip, awkward institutions have a way of becoming intolerable. They were armed, but not as a royal army was armed. They had a military identity sanctified by crusade, disciplined by vows, and wrapped in the authority of holy service. A noble with soldiers could be negotiated with, punished, married into, or crushed through feudal politics. A military order was stranger. Its power was not just territorial, it was spiritual, financial, and symbolic. Philip did not need the Templars to be guilty in order to need them weakened. That is the point where the story begins to darken in a different way. Heresy may have been the official language of the attack, but power supplied the grammar. The accusations against the order were shocking. Yet they also arrived in a political environment where shocking accusations could solve practical problems. If the Templars were exposed as enemies of the faith, then action against them was not theft. It was purification. It was not royal opportunism. It was Christian duty. A perfect enemy is one whose destruction can be made to look like virtue. The Templars were almost designed for that role, not by intention, but by circumstance. They were famous enough for their fall to matter, secretive enough for accusation to seem plausible, wealthy enough for their assets to tempt powerful men, independent enough to irritate the crown, religious enough that a charge of corruption would horrify the public, military enough that hesitation could be framed as danger. Philip's genius, if we want to call it that, was not inventing every fear about the Templars from nothing. It was recognizing that existing unease could be organized into a case. By the early 14th century, the crusading dream had changed. The great victories that had once made the military orders seem like the cutting edge of Christendom were now memories mixed with disappointment. The loss of major crusader holdings in the East damaged the prestige of the orders whose purpose had been tied to that world. If the Holy Land was no longer securely held, people could ask uncomfortable questions. Why did these orders still possess so much? What exactly were they doing? Why should they continue to enjoy privileges earned in a struggle that seemed to have failed? That does not mean the Templars had become useless. Institutions often outlive the circumstances that created them and find new roles. But public imagination is not always patient with institutional explanations. A military order without a triumphant crusading frontier could begin to look like a relic with a bank attached. Philip's court could exploit that. The charges of heresy gave moral shape to political action. They transformed financial pressure into righteous investigation. They allowed royal authority to present itself as defender of the faith against a hidden enemy. And because the alleged crimes were said to occur in secret, the absence of public proof did not immediately weaken the case. Secrecy became part of the evidence. This is one of the oldest tricks in the politics of accusation. The more hidden the crime is said to be, the more denial can be interpreted as confirmation. If the Templars protested innocence, that might mean they were lying to protect their secret. If they confessed, the confession proved guilt. If they recanted, that could be dismissed as fear, pride, or manipulation. A closed order was trapped inside the logic of its own privacy. Philip also understood the power of timing. A king does not attack an institution like the Templars casually. He needs preparation, legal framing, cooperation from officials, and enough control over the first wave of the story that the accused do not define it themselves. The arrests in 1307 would show a level of coordination that feels less like a spontaneous response to spiritual horror and more like a state operation. The order was not merely questioned, it was seized. To be clear, political motive does not automatically prove innocence. This is another place where careful storytelling must resist easy comfort. A corrupt prosecution can uncover real wrongdoing. A greedy king can point to genuine abuses. A biased investigation can still contain fragments of truth. The presence of Philip's motives does not make every Templar pure. It does, however, force us to treat the case with suspicion. When the judge wants the property, the verdict deserves closer examination. And Philip had reasons to want more than property. The Templars represented a model of authority that did not fit neatly into the royal future he was building. They belonged to a world of crusading privilege, papal protection, noble donation, and transnational religious mission. Philip represented a harder political world, one in which kings increasingly claimed the right to discipline, tax, and command within their realms. The clash was not only between one king and one order, it was between two ways of organizing power. The Templars looked backward to Jerusalem. Philip looked inward to France. That contrast does not explain everything, but it helps us see why the order could become so vulnerable. Their holiness did not protect them once holiness itself was put on trial. Their wealth did not protect them once wealth became proof of corruption. Their secrecy did not protect them once secrecy became the story. Their military reputation did not protect them once the crown could present them as a hidden threat inside the kingdom. In that sense, Philip did not simply destroy the Templars. He changed what they meant. Before the attack, They could be seen as flawed servants of a battered crusading ideal. After the attack, they became the kind of men who might gather behind locked doors to deny the very Christ they publicly served. That transformation was political violence of a very high order. It did not only seize bodies and buildings, it seized interpretation. The question is not whether Philip believed the accusations. Perhaps he did. Powerful people are fully capable of believing what benefits them. The sharper question is whether belief and advantage became indistinguishable. When a ruler discovers that his enemy is also, conveniently, an enemy of God, history teaches us to lean closer and listen for the machinery behind the sermon. With Philip, the Templar mystery becomes less about what may have been hidden in the order and more about what could be revealed in the state. A king under pressure found in the Templars, an enemy that solved too many problems at once. Their fall could answer debt, assert authority, impress the fearful, and bend a religious institution beneath royal will. Heresy was the flame placed before the public. Behind it stood the colder shape of power, and once power had chosen its enemy, confession would not be far behind. Chapter 9. Confessions, written under pain. The arrests came before dawn. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, the machinery of the French crown moved against the Templars across Philip's kingdom. Men who had worn the cross for decades woke not to a summons, not to a formal debate before church authority, but to royal officers at the door. Houses were entered. Brothers were seized. Documents and property were taken. The order that had once seemed almost untouchable was suddenly trapped inside a net cast by the state. There is a reason that date still clings to the story. Not because it created every superstition later attached to it. Those came later, embroidered by imagination. But because the operation itself feels chillingly modern, coordinated, administrative, prepared in secrecy, and justified by accusations so severe that ordinary hesitation could be painted as complicity. Philip's government did not merely ask whether the Templars were guilty. It acted as though guilt had already become a fact, waiting to be recorded. The brothers were accused of crimes that struck at the center of Christian identity: denial of Christ, contempt for the cross, idolatry, obscene initiation practices, and hidden corruption. These were not small charges. They were designed to make sympathy difficult. A man accused of greed might still have friends. A man accused of secretly rejecting Christ while wearing his cross becomes dangerous to defend. Then came interrogation. To read the trial material with any seriousness is to feel the problem immediately. Confessions appear, sometimes in alarming detail. Brothers admit to denying Christ. Some speak of spitting on the cross. Some describe strange kisses or secret instructions. A surface reading can look devastating. The order seems to condemn itself from its own mouth. But the mouth, in these rooms, was not free. Torture and the threat of torture shaped the evidence. Some men were imprisoned under harsh conditions. Some were placed under pressure by officials who already knew the story they wanted confirmed. Pain does not simply extract information. It reorganizes reality. It teaches the prisoner what answer brings relief, what denial brings more suffering, what detail seems to satisfy the men asking the questions. This does not mean every confession is automatically false. That would be too easy, and history rarely rewards easy answers. But it means every confession must be handled as damaged evidence, not useless. Damaged. There is a difference. A tortured man may tell a truth he has hidden for years. He may also repeat a lie he thinks will save his body. He may blend memory with suggestion. He may admit to a symbolic act, but not understand the theological meaning being attached to it. He may say yes to a question framed so tightly that every answer serves the prosecution. Later, when the pain stops, he may recant, or he may not recant because fear has become permanent. The Templar case is full of that instability. Some brothers confessed, then withdrew their confessions. Some denied the charges consistently. Some admitted only parts of the accusations. Some gave accounts that resembled one another closely enough to raise suspicion of a shared script. Others differed enough to raise a different suspicion, that if there was wrongdoing, it may not have been uniform across the order. The trial record does not speak in one voice. It trembles. And that trembling is important. A modern viewer may ask why innocent men would confess to such terrible things. The question is understandable, but it belongs to a safer world than the one these men inhabited. Under medieval interrogation, confession was not always a window into conscience. Sometimes it was a strategy for survival. Sometimes it was an act of exhaustion. Sometimes it was the only path a prisoner could see through the next hour. The body has its own theology under pain. The Crown's officials understood the value of confession. A charge denied by everyone can look weak. A charge confessed by the accused becomes public truth, even if the method used to obtain it is morally rotten. Once enough Templars had admitted something, anything, the image of the order changed. The public no longer saw only accusation. It saw apparent confirmation. This is why the early confessions mattered so much. They helped create a climate in which the order could be judged before it was properly heard. They gave Philip's campaign the sound of legitimacy. They placed the Pope under greater pressure. They made defenders hesitate. After all, how does one defend an order whose own brothers have confessed to denying Christ? The answer, of course, is that one asks how those confessions were made, but that question takes time, patience, and courage. Political campaigns prefer speed. Scandal prefers simplicity. The Crown had already supplied the story. The Templars were not merely flawed. They were secretly rotten. The confessions gave that story a human voice, even if the voice had been forced through terror. One of the cruelest features of such trials is that they transform suffering into evidence. The prisoner is hurt until he speaks. Then his speech is used to justify the hurt. If he later recants, the recantation can be dismissed as defiance, manipulation, or fear of punishment by his fellow brothers. If he remains silent, silence can be interpreted as stubborn guilt. The accused finds every exit sealed. For the Templars, this trap was especially effective because the alleged crimes were said to occur in secret. There were no public witnesses to the initiation chamber. There was no crowd that had seen the idol. There was no open sermon preaching forbidden doctrine. The prosecution depended on insiders, and insiders under pressure could be pinned to describe the hidden world the Crown needed the public to imagine. The result was not a clear investigation. It was a fog with documents inside it. That may sound too poetic, but it is also practical. Historians are left with records that cannot simply be thrown away and cannot simply be trusted. The documents preserve voices of Templar brothers, but those voices often come to us through hostile hands, legal formulas, translation, fear, and pain. The record is both invaluable and contaminated. This is what makes the case so haunting. If the Templars had left no confessions, their defenders could call the whole affair an obvious fabrication. If the confessions had been freely given, consistent, and supported by physical evidence, their guilt would be easier to accept. Instead, we are left in the middle. Enough testimony to disturb, enough coercion to doubt, enough contradiction to prevent closure. That middle space became the birthplace of legend. A clean acquittal would have made one kind of story. A clean conviction would have made another. But the Templars received neither. They were crushed under accusations that sounded terrifying, supported by confessions that may have been bent into shape by suffering, judged by powers that had strong reasons to see them fall. By the time the smoke of interrogation began to clear, the order was no longer merely defending itself against charges. It was defending itself against the image those charges had created. And images are harder to free than prisoners. The Templars could deny. They could recant. Some could insist that what they had said was torn from them by fear. But the public imagination had already seen the hidden ceremony, the violated cross, the idol in the darkness. Whether those things were real, distorted, local, symbolic, or invented, they now belonged to the story of the order. Confessions written under pain do not end a mystery. They deepen it. Because the question is no longer only what the Templars did behind closed doors. It is what a kingdom can make men say once it has decided what the truth must sound like. Chapter 10. The Pope who hesitated. Pope Clement V did not enter this story as a man holding all the cards. That is easy to forget. From a distance, the medieval pope can look like the final authority, the white-robed judge above kings, armies, and accusations. In theory, the Templars belonged to the Church. They were a religious order, protected by papal privilege, answerable to a spiritual hierarchy that no secular king was supposed to casually override. If anyone had the right to investigate them, discipline them, or dissolve them, it was the Pope. But theory has a way of thinning when a king arrives with soldiers, prisoners, documents, and a public scandal already in motion. Clement V was under pressure from the beginning. Philip IV had acted first. The French crown had arrested Templars, seized property, and broadcast the charges before the Pope could control the shape of the case. That mattered. Once accusations of heresy became public, Clement could not simply wave them away as a royal inconvenience. To ignore them would risk appearing indifferent to corruption inside one of Christendom's most famous orders. To accept them too quickly would risk surrendering papal authority to a king who had already overstepped. He was trapped between danger and danger. This is why Clement should not be reduced to a cartoon villain, sitting calmly in judgment while the Templars burned. His role was more complicated, and perhaps more humanly uncomfortable. He had to protect the Church's dignity while dealing with a monarch skilled at forcing decisions. He had to consider whether the Templars were guilty, whether the confessions could be trusted, whether the scandal had already made the order impossible to preserve, and whether resistance to Philip might create an even greater rupture. None of that makes Clement heroic. It simply makes him less simple. There were moments when he resisted the French king's control over the proceedings. He objected to the crown acting independently. He sought to bring the matter back under papal authority. He had reason to be cautious, especially as questions grew about how the confessions had been obtained. A pope did not need to be a modern defender of legal rights to understand that torture could complicate truth. The Church's own procedures were not gentle by modern standards, but even within that world, Jurisdiction and proper process mattered. Philip had turned the Templars into a public emergency. Clement had to turn that emergency back into a church investigation. That was not easy once the image of the order had been poisoned. The Templars were not accused of minor misconduct that could be corrected with penance and reform. They were accused of secret denial, idolatry, and ritual pollution. If the charges were false, the king had committed an extraordinary assault on a papal order. If they were true, the church had allowed a diseased institution to operate for generations under sacred privilege. Either conclusion carried humiliation. The Pope's hesitation came from that unbearable middle ground. He could not fully trust Philip. He could not fully ignore him. He could not pretend the confessions had no effect. He could not pretend the methods used to produce them were clean. He could not restore the order easily, because public confidence had been shattered. But he also could not condemn the order without facing the thinness and instability of the evidence. This is the part of the story where power becomes quieter, but no less forceful. Philip did not need to stand over Clement every hour with a drawn sword. Pressure can work through expectation, diplomacy, proximity, dependence, and the simple fact that the French king had already changed the public reality. Once the crown had made the Templars appear monstrous, Clement's options narrowed. A decision that might have been possible before the arrests became almost impossible afterward. That is one of Philip's most effective moves. He made the scandal irreversible before the Pope could judge it. Clement's position also reminds us that institutions often care about truth and survival at the same time. Those motives are not identical, and they can come into conflict. The Church needed to know whether the Templars had truly fallen into heresy, but it also needed to protect the faithful from scandal, defend its own authority, and prevent a political crisis from tearing open a larger wound. In that environment, a verdict can become less about what happened in every initiation chamber, and more about what can still be governed after the accusation has done its work. This does not satisfy the modern hunger for justice. We want the Pope either to condemn the guilty or defend the innocent. We want a clean moral shape. But Clement's world offered him a damaged case, a powerful king, frightened witnesses, recanted confessions, public outrage, and an order whose reputation had become almost impossible to repair. The question was no longer only, are the Templars heretics? It was also, can the Templars continue to exist after being believed to be heretics? That second question may have mattered more than anyone wished to admit. A religious order depends on trust. Its vows must be believed. Its symbols must be legible. Its brothers must be seen as disciplined servants of God, not as men who might secretly mock the cross behind locked doors. Even if many accusations were distorted or coerced, the public wound remained. A restored Templar order would have carried the trial like a brand. Every commandery would be followed by rumor. Every new brother would enter under suspicion. Every privilege would look offensive to enemies who thought the order had escaped justice. Clement had to weigh not only guilt, but ruin. That is a cold distinction. But history often turns on cold distinctions. The Pope's hesitation, then, was not weakness alone. It was the visible sign of a case that would not settle into certainty. If the evidence had been overwhelming and clean, hesitation would be harder to explain. If the accusation had been obviously absurd, decisive defense would have been easier. Instead, Clement moved within a fog of coerced testimony, political pressure, and institutional fear. And in that fog, the Templars slowly lost the most important protection they had ever possessed. not their castles, not their treasure, not their swords. They lost the confidence that the church would save them as an order. Once that confidence weakened, the outcome became less a matter of dramatic revelation and more a process of suffocation. The Templars could still be investigated. Their leaders could still be questioned. Some could still be absolved personally, but the institution itself was bleeding authority, and every delay made the wound harder to close. Clement's story matters because it prevents the fall of the Templars from becoming too neat. He was not simply Philip's puppet, and he was not the order's rescuer. He was a pressured pope trying to preserve control over a crisis another man had already ignited. His hesitation shows us that the official story of Templar guilt was never as solid as Philip needed it to appear. A confident prosecution does not always mean a confident truth. Sometimes it means the loudest power reached the room first. Chapter 11. The Chignon Parchment. For centuries, the Templar story seemed to move toward one conclusion: accusation, confession, suppression, fire. Then a document complicated the ending, not with a dramatic treasure map, not with a hidden gospel wrapped in silk, not with a confession from a dying Grand Master revealing what the order had truly guarded. The object was quieter than that. A parchment, a record of papal investigation from 1308, connected to proceedings at Chinon, where senior Templar leaders were examined by representatives of Pope Clement V. Its importance lies in what it suggests. The leaders of the order, including Jacques de Molay, were not simply abandoned to the judgment of Philip's machinery without papal attention. They were questioned under church authority, and according to the evidence associated with Chinon, the senior Templars received absolution for heresy after expressing repentance for certain acts. That does not mean they were declared spotless. It does not mean every accusation vanished, but it does mean the story was not as clean as the public legend later made it seem. This is where the ground shifts. If the Templar leadership had been investigated by papal envoys and absolved from heresy, then the image of the order as a clearly condemned enemy of Christianity becomes harder to maintain. The Church's own handling of the case appears more nuanced, more uncertain, and more politically constrained than the popular version allows. The parchment does not rescue the Templars into innocence. It does something more historically useful. It makes the verdict uncomfortable, and discomfort is often where truth begins to breathe. The Chinon evidence matters because it separates personal guilt, ritual misconduct, institutional scandal, and formal heresy. These are not identical categories. A man might admit to a shameful act during initiation and still not be judged a doctrinal heretic. A leader might be absolved after repentance while the order itself remains damaged beyond repair. A ceremony might be condemned as abusive or blasphemous without proving that the Templars secretly worshipped another god. This distinction is subtle but essential. The popular imagination prefers binary outcomes: guilty or innocent, heretics or martyrs, guardians of secret Christianity or victims of a greedy king. The Chinon material resists that simplicity. It suggests that church officials could see sin, scandal, and error without necessarily finding a fully heretical religion at the heart of the order. That is not a small difference. To be absolved of heresy did not mean the accusations were meaningless. It meant the matter had been judged, at least at that moment and for those men, in a way that allowed reconciliation with the church. Medieval absolution was not a compliment. It was a spiritual act that presumed fault, repentance, and restoration. So we should not turn Chinon into a modern acquittal. That would be too neat. but neither should we ignore its force. If Clement's representatives believed the highest Templar leaders could be absolved, then the destruction of the entire order becomes less about a proven secret religion and more about a collapse of trust under unbearable pressure. The parchment reveals a church trying to manage a scandal that had outrun the evidence. It shows a pope's authority still present, still investigating, still distinguishing between men and institution, between acts and doctrine. The tragedy is that such distinctions rarely survive public panic. By the time these investigations unfolded, Philip had already changed the weather. The Templars had been arrested. Confessions had circulated. The name of the order had been darkened. A careful papal finding could not easily undo the spectacle of royal accusation. Once people had imagined the initiation chamber, the violated cross, and the head in the dark, a parchment could not fully restore the white mantle. Documents can clarify history. They do not always heal reputation. The Chinon parchment also helps explain why Clement's later decisions feel so conflicted. If the Pope had believed with absolute certainty that the Templars were doctrinal enemies of the faith, the path would have been clearer. If he had believed they were wholly innocent, another path might have been possible, though still dangerous. Instead, he faced a middle reality. Senior leaders could be absolved, but the order was surrounded by scandal. Evidence was compromised, but not empty. Philip's pressure was obvious, but the public wound was real. In that middle reality, justice becomes difficult to recognize. The parchment asks us to hold two thoughts at once. First, the Templars were likely not proven to be the organized guardians of an alternative, forbidden Christianity. Second, they may not have been innocent of every abusive, irregular, or degrading practice alleged in some testimonies. The evidence points less toward a hidden church and more toward an institution whose internal customs, secrecy, and power made it vulnerable to both real criticism and political destruction. This is not the version legend prefers. Legend wants Chinon to be a locked door suddenly opened. It wants the parchment to say, plainly, the Templars were innocent. It does not quite say that. It is more interesting because it does not. It offers something less romantic, but more revealing. The official case against the order was unstable enough that even within the church, the highest leaders could be restored spiritually while their institution remained doomed. That contradiction is the heart of the matter. The men could be absolved, but the order could still die. That may seem strange until we remember that institutions live by more than the innocence of individuals. They live by usefulness, trust, protection, patronage, and the willingness of powerful authorities to defend their existence. The Templars had lost too much of that. Their reputation had become a battlefield no parchment could entirely pacify. Chinon therefore changes the central question. It no longer lets us ask only, were the Templars guilty? It forces a sharper question. Guilty of what? According to whom? Under what pressure? And with what consequence? Were they guilty of heresy as a doctrine? Of scandalous initiation practices? Of secrecy that bred suspicion? Of being too independent? Of being too wealthy? Of becoming politically inconvenient at exactly the wrong moment? Those questions do not produce a single clean answer, but they do produce a more honest investigation. The parchment also reminds us how easily historical memory can flatten complexity. For a long time, many people knew the Templars mainly through the drama of their fall: arrest, torture, confession, execution. Later they became symbols, either of noble persecution or occult corruption. But the surviving record shows a messier process, with hesitation, inquiry, absolution, pressure, and contradiction. That messiness is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Because the fall of the Templars was not merely a legal event, it was a struggle over meaning. Philip wanted them understood as hidden enemies of the faith. Later, Romantics wanted them understood as guardians of sacred secrets. Some modern defenders want them understood as innocent martyrs. The Chinon evidence resists all of these complete victories. It says, look closer. Look at the distinction between sin and heresy. Look at the gap between confession and truth. Look at the pressure placed on the Pope. Look at how an institution can be spiritually reconciled in one room and politically destroyed in another. That last point may be the most haunting. The Chinon proceedings suggest that the Church did not simply see the Templars as a lost cause from the beginning. There were still attempts to examine, classify, and perhaps contain the damage. But history does not always move according to the careful categories of canon law. Sometimes the public story becomes stronger than the legal one. A parchment can preserve a judgment. It cannot always stop a fire. And so the Chinon evidence does not end the mystery. It deepens it in a quieter direction. It suggests that the Templars were not cleanly proven to be the enemies their destroyers needed them to be. Yet it also leaves us with an order too compromised, too feared, and too politically exposed to survive. The most dangerous revelations are not always the ones that prove a conspiracy. Sometimes they prove that the truth was known to be complicated, and the world chose a simpler ending anyway. Chapter 12. Suppressed, but not proven guilty. In 1312, the Templars did not fall by a clean verdict. That is one of the most important details in the entire story, and one of the easiest to lose beneath the drama of prison cells, confessions, and fire. The order was not simply examined, found guilty in a clear and final judgment, and erased because the evidence had settled beyond doubt. What happened was more complicated and more revealing. The order was suppressed. The document associated with that decision, Vox in Excelso, did not present the fall of the Templars as a triumphant legal conclusion proving their secret heresy beyond question. Instead, it moved through a darker and more practical logic. The scandal was too great. The reputation of the order was too damaged. The suspicions had become too widespread. The institution, even if not cleanly condemned as heretical, had become impossible to preserve without harming the Church. That is a very different kind of death. A guilty verdict says, this institution deserves destruction because its crimes are proven. And suppression says something colder. Whether or not every charge can be proven, this institution can no longer safely continue. For the Templars, that distinction was everything. It meant the order could be destroyed without the Church having to solve every contradiction in the evidence. It meant the Pope could act against the institution without declaring every brother a heretic. It meant Philip's political campaign could still achieve its central result, even if the theological case remained unstable. And it meant later generations would inherit not closure, but a wound shaped like an unanswered question. The suppression of the Templars shows how reputation can become a sentence. By 1312, the name of the order had been dragged through years of accusation. Men had confessed under pressure. Others had recanted. Rumors had hardened into public memory. The image of the Templar as a warrior of Christ had been replaced, in many minds, by the image of a man entering a locked room to deny Christ. Whether that image was true in every detail mattered less and less as the scandal grew. This is not justice in the pure sense. It is institutional survival. Clement V faced a problem larger than a legal file. If he defended the order completely, he risked appearing to protect men accused of the worst spiritual crimes. If he condemned the order as fully heretical, he risked overstating a case whose evidence was damaged by coercion, inconsistency, and political interference. Suppression allowed him to take a third path: remove the institution, redistribute its responsibilities, and try to stop the scandal from spreading further. It was a solution designed for a crisis, not for clarity. That is why the Templar story refuses to behave like a simple morality play. Philip wanted a monstrous enemy. Later romantics wanted innocent martyrs. Occult legends wanted hidden masters of forbidden wisdom. But the suppression itself suggests something more bureaucratic and more tragic. A powerful religious institution can be ended not because its guilt is perfectly proven, but because its continued existence has become intolerable to those who govern the world around it. This does not make the Templars saints. Some brothers may have participated in rough or degrading rites. Some may have been guilty of abuses that the order failed to correct. The secrecy of the institution may have protected bad customs and unhealthy obedience. A careful investigation does not need to turn every Templar into a victim without flaw, but it also does not allow us to pretend the official end proves the darkest accusations. Suppression is not the same as proof of a hidden church. If the Templars had truly guarded a forbidden Christianity as an organized doctrine, we would expect the final destruction of the order to reveal that more plainly. We would expect clearer theological findings, stronger doctrinal evidence, something more substantial than damaged confessions and scandal management. Instead, what emerges is an institution judged too compromised to survive, even though the deepest claims against it remained clouded. That cloudiness matters. It is the reason the Templars became so useful to memory. A clean condemnation would have made them one more heretical movement crushed by authority. A clean acquittal would have made them victims of slander. But suppression without full proof left them suspended between guilt and innocence, between sin and conspiracy, between royal greed and possible corruption. That suspension gave the legend room to grow. There is a quiet cruelty in this. An institution can be erased in law, while its members remain trapped in suspicion. Even those not personally condemned could not simply return to the old world. The white mantle had been stained too deeply. The order's lands, privileges, and name would pass into history, but the accusations remained attached like burrs. Men who had once served under a celebrated cross now belonged to a story no one could fully untangle. The assets of the Templars did not vanish into a single treasure chamber, despite what later legend would prefer. Much of their property was intended to pass to other religious military purposes, especially to the Hospitallers, though the actual transfer was often messy, delayed, and shaped by local politics. That practical aftermath is worth remembering. The fall of the order was not only a mystical drama, it was also an administrative event. Lands reassigned, revenues disputed, buildings repurposed, brothers pensioned or absorbed, files closed where possible. History often looks less romantic when the accountants arrive. And yet, the lack of romance makes the mystery sharper, not weaker. If the destruction of the Templars had been only about hidden treasure, the story would be easier to dismiss. But the real mechanism was more unsettling. Accusation, fear, pressure, law, property, reputation, and institutional damage working together until survival became impossible. No single cause is large enough by itself. The Templars were not suppressed simply because they were rich. Other institutions were rich. They were not suppressed simply because they were secretive. Other religious orders had private rights. They were not suppressed simply because Philip hated their independence. Royal hostility needed moral language. They were not suppressed simply because of heresy accusations. Those accusations needed political force behind them. Their fall came from the combination: a wealthy order with unusual privileges, a damaged crusading purpose, secretive internal life, frightening accusations, coerced confessions, papal hesitation, and a king determined to bend the outcome. All of it converged. By 1312, the question may no longer have been whether the Templars deserved to exist. It may have been whether anyone powerful enough still wished to defend their existence. The answer was no. That is the most sobering lesson of Vox in Excelso. The document did not need to solve the mystery in order to end the order. Power does not always require perfect proof. Sometimes it requires only a damaged reputation, a plausible danger, and a moment when resistance costs more than surrender. So when we ask whether the Templars were destroyed because they protected forbidden Christianity, the suppression complicates the answer. The evidence does not clearly show a hidden doctrine preserved inside the order, but it does show that the accusation of hidden corruption became powerful enough to destroy them, even without a clean verdict of doctrinal guilt. In the end, the Templars were not proven into oblivion. They were made impossible. Chapter 13. From Heresy Trial to Grail Myth. After the order was suppressed, the Templars should have become a closed file. Their lands were reassigned. Their surviving members faded into other lives, other houses, other arrangements. Their leaders were dead or disgraced. The legal machinery had done what it was designed to do: remove the institution from the world of active power. But history does not always obey paperwork. The Templars disappeared as an order and then returned as an idea. That second life proved far harder to control. In the centuries after their fall, the accusations that had once been used to destroy them began to change shape. Heresy became mystery. Mystery became romance. Romance became conspiracy. And eventually, the Templars were no longer only warrior monks accused of secret corruption. They became guardians of the Grail, protectors of hidden bloodlines, keepers of lost gospels, architects of occult wisdom, and silent witnesses to another Christianity buried beneath the official one. The transformation is fascinating because it tells us less about the medieval Templars than about the needs of later ages. A legal scandal is tied to its moment. A myth can keep finding new rooms to inhabit. The Grail, for example, had its own medieval literary life before it became permanently fused with the Templar imagination. In romances, the Grail could appear as a sacred vessel, a mysterious object, a test of spiritual purity, or a symbol of divine grace. It belonged to a world of knights, quests, wounded kings, hidden castles, and questions that had to be asked at the right time. It was already powerful as literature. The Templars entered that imaginative world because they seemed to fit its architecture. They had been knights. They had been religious. They had been connected to the Holy Land. They had been destroyed under accusations involving secret rites. They had left behind enough uncertainty to invite embroidery. If someone wanted guardians for a sacred object too dangerous or too holy for ordinary hands, the Templars were almost too perfect. This is where the legend begins to feed on resemblance. The Templars looked like Grail Guardians, so they became Grail Guardians. They had once occupied sacred ground, so they became discoverers of sacred secrets. They were accused of hiding an idol, so later writers imagined they might have hidden something else. They were ruined by power, so later audiences could imagine that power had silenced them for knowing too much. None of this proves the story true. It explains why the story felt right. As modern centuries unfolded, the Templars were repeatedly remade. Enlightenment critics, romantic writers, occult movements, nationalist fantasies, secret societies, and modern thrillers all found uses for them. Each age dressed the order in its own anxieties. For some, they became enemies of clerical oppression. For others, they became initiates of ancient wisdom. For still others, they became victims of royal greed, or proof that official religion had suppressed a deeper truth. The medieval evidence was often treated less like a boundary and more like a box of props. A strange head became a symbol of forbidden knowledge. A coerced confession became a clue. A papal hesitation became proof of concealment. The Temple Mount became a doorway to lost scripture. Southern France became a refuge of hidden belief. The suppression of the order became not an institutional crisis, but the final act of a secret war over Christianity itself. It is easy to mock these later myths, and sometimes they deserve it. A great deal has been built on thin evidence, mistranslation, wishful thinking, and the simple pleasure of making history more cinematic than it was. The Templars have been made responsible for almost every kind of secret imaginable, which usually tells us that the evidence has stopped leading and appetite has taken over. But the myths should not be dismissed too quickly either. They survived because the original story had unresolved pressure inside it. The trials were not clean. The confessions were not clean. The suppression was not clean. The leaders were absolved in one context and destroyed in another. The order's reputation was ruined without a simple doctrinal verdict that satisfied every question. Later imagination did not invent uncertainty from nothing. It inherited it. What it often did was exaggerate the uncertainty into certainty of another kind. Where the record says, "This is unclear," legend says, "This was hidden." Where the evidence says, "The testimony is unreliable," legend says, "The truth was suppressed." Where history says, "Political motives mattered," legend says, "A secret doctrine was feared," and these moves are understandable, even seductive. But they are not the same as proof. The idea of a Templar-protected bloodline or hidden gospel belongs largely to modern myth-making, not to secure medieval documentation. It reflects a very modern hunger. The suspicion that official institutions have concealed the real origins of faith, power, and identity. In that sense, the Templars became useful because they stand at the crossing of several roads. Christianity and violence, wealth and poverty, secrecy and public devotion, East and West, guilt and victimhood. They are a mystery machine. Put almost any secret into them, and the story will run. Yet the more serious question is why people keep wanting the Templars to have guarded a forbidden Christianity. Perhaps because such a story turns institutional destruction into martyrdom. Perhaps because it allows us to imagine that lost truth survives somewhere, protected by a brotherhood brave enough to die for it. Perhaps because the official story of power crushing an inconvenient order feels too grim unless something sacred was at stake. There is also a quieter reason. The Templars expose a discomfort at the heart of religious history. Christianity was never lived as a single flat thing. It contained official doctrine, local devotion, mystical longing, political authority, relic culture, crusading violence, reform movements, dissent, and fear of dissent. The boundary between orthodoxy and danger was often guarded fiercely because it was not always emotionally simple. The Templar myth gives that complexity a face: a white mantle, a sealed initiation, a burning master, a missing answer. That is why the Grail version of the story still attracts attention, even when the evidence remains weak. The Grail is not just an object. It is a symbol of hidden wholeness, the idea that something sacred has been lost and might still be recovered. Attach that to the Templars, and their defeat becomes more than a political and religious scandal. It becomes a quest interrupted by violence. But careful investigation must keep the romance in its place. The medieval Templars do not need to have guarded the Grail to be historically compelling. They do not need a bloodline, a secret gospel, or an occult master plan. Their real story already contains enough tension. Men sworn to poverty inside a wealthy institution, warriors claiming sacred obedience, a king weaponizing scandal, a pope trying to navigate disaster, and an order destroyed without the clarity its legend keeps searching for. The myth of the Grail tells us what later centuries wanted from the Templars. The trial records tell us what their enemies wanted to prove. Between those two worlds, the actual order remains harder to grasp. Not empty, not innocent beyond question, not guilty in the theatrical way legend often suggests, but caught in the fatal space between secrecy and power. That space is where myth grows best. The Templars became guardians of forbidden Christianity because their history left behind the right kind of silence. Not a silence that proves the secret was real, but a silence large enough for generations to keep listening. Chapter 14. What they may really have protected. By now, the title question has changed shape. At the beginning, it sounded almost like a locked room mystery. Did the Templars guard a forbidden Christianity? Did they carry some hidden doctrine from Jerusalem into Europe? A dangerous truth wrapped in ritual, buried beneath vows, protected by swords and silence. The deeper we follow the evidence, the less that answer looks simple. There is no solid medieval proof that the Knights Templar preserved a formal alternative church. No surviving rule of the order reveals a secret gospel. No clear body of doctrine emerges from the trial records. The accusations are dramatic, but often unstable. The legends are powerful, but often late. The geography is suggestive, but geography is not confession, and yet, it would be a mistake to walk away saying there was nothing dangerous about the Templars. There was. It may simply not have been the danger later myth preferred. What they protected, above all, was a kind of independence that made powerful men uneasy. They were a religious order, but not merely local clergy. They were warriors, but not simply royal soldiers. They held wealth, but did not belong to one family, one kingdom, or one crown. They operated across borders in an age when kings increasingly wanted sharper borders around their authority. That alone was enough to make them unsettling. The Templars belonged to an older, wider idea of Christendom. A world where loyalty could flow upward through the church, eastward toward Jerusalem, inward through vows, and outward across a network of commanderies, fortresses, estates, and financial obligations. A king like Philip IV wanted power to flow differently. He wanted authority gathered, recorded, taxed, disciplined, and brought nearer to the crown. The Templars did not fit comfortably into that future. Their secrecy made the problem worse. Not because secrecy automatically proves guilt, but because secrecy protects meaning from outside control. A public institution can be argued with in public language. A private one requires trust. Once trust breaks, every closed door becomes evidence against it. This may be the most realistic version of the forbidden thing they guarded. Not a hidden creed, but a hidden internal world. Inside that world were vows, memories, habits, loyalties, rituals, financial knowledge, and an identity shaped by crusade. Some of that world was perfectly ordinary for a religious order. Some of it may have been harsh or irregular. Some of it may have been misunderstood by outsiders. Some of it may have been deliberately shielded because institutions rarely survive by making themselves completely transparent. But to the crown, that protected interior was a problem. The Templars had spiritual authority that did not come from Philip. They had a history that made them difficult to treat as common subjects. They had a reputation built on sacrifice, discipline, and holy war. They had served causes larger than France, and that mattered in a century when France was becoming more than a loose collection of lordships. It was becoming a political engine. An institution with another engine inside it was bound to draw attention. This is where the idea of forbidden Christianity can be understood in a less literal, but perhaps more revealing way. The Templars may not have guarded a banned doctrine about Christ. They may have embodied a version of Christian power that was becoming inconvenient, armed, international, privileged, wealthy, and not fully obedient to the emerging state. That kind of Christianity was not heretical in the usual sense, but it was politically dangerous. It claimed sacred authority without being easily governable. It moved money without being merely commercial. It carried weapons without being merely secular. It used poverty as an ideal while managing enormous resources. It could stand before a king and, by its very structure, imply that not all meaningful power passed through the throne. For a ruler determined to centralize authority, that implication could feel intolerable. So the accusation of heresy did something very useful. It translated political danger into spiritual language. Instead of saying, "This order is too independent," one could say, "This order denies Christ." Instead of saying, "Their wealth should be brought under control," one could say, "Their wealth was gained through corruption and idolatry." Instead of admitting that the crown wanted to discipline a rival center of influence, one could claim to be defending the faith from a hidden infection. That translation is one of the keys to the entire fall. It does not require Philip and his ministers to invent every detail from nothing. It only requires them to take existing vulnerabilities and arrange them into the most destructive pattern possible. Secret initiation became anti-Christian ritual. Wealth became evidence of hidden power. International privilege became disloyalty. Internal discipline became conspiracy. The order's difference became its crime. The tragedy is that the Templars helped make this possible by being difficult to read. They were not transparent saints. They were a human institution, and human institutions develop habits that outsiders cannot easily interpret. Power creates arrogance. Secrecy creates abuse. Loyalty creates silence. A brotherhood forged for war may treat obedience as a virtue, even when obedience becomes spiritually dangerous. The Templars did not need to be guardians of a hidden gospel to have things worth criticizing. That is the uncomfortable balance. They were likely victims of a politically motivated destruction. They may also have carried internal practices that gave their enemies material to distort. Their fall was not justified by clean proof of heresy, but neither does the failure of the prosecution turn the order into pure light. History is rarely that generous. What they may really have protected was a structure of authority that belonged to the crusading age, a structure where men could be both monks and soldiers, poor and wealthy, obedient and strangely independent, servants of Christ and managers of immense practical power. That structure had once been celebrated as necessary. By the early 14th century, it could be framed as suspicious, even dangerous. The world around them had changed. The dream of Jerusalem no longer held the same political force it once had. The Crusader states had suffered catastrophic losses. European kings were becoming more administratively ambitious. The papacy itself was under pressure. In that shifting world, the Templars looked less like the heroic edge of Christendom and more like an expensive, secretive survival from a fading order of things. And fading institutions are vulnerable, not because they are weak, necessarily, but because people begin to ask why they still deserve their privileges. The answer the Templars might have given, service, sacrifice, tradition, sacred mission, no longer protected them as it once had. Philip offered a harsher answer. They did not deserve survival at all. So perhaps the forbidden Christianity in this story is not a lost gospel hidden under the Temple Mount. Perhaps it is the uncomfortable fact that Christianity itself, in medieval Europe, could take forms that challenged other powers. It could be royal, papal, monastic, military, mystical, local, reforming, dissenting, wealthy, poor, obedient, rebellious, and sometimes several of these at once. The Templars stood at one of the strangest intersections of that world. They did not have to guard another Christianity. They were already a troubling version of Christian power. That is why the accusations worked so well. They gave a name to a fear that was already present. They made visible, in monstrous form, the unease people felt toward an order that was too rich for poverty, too armed for monks, too secretive for trust, and too independent for kings. The myth says the Templars protected a forbidden truth. The evidence suggests something colder and more human. They protected a form of authority that no longer had enough defenders. And when the fire finally came for them, it did not only burn men. It burned a way of belonging to Christendom that the New Age was no longer willing to tolerate. Chapter 15. The silence after the flames. The fire on the island in the Seine did not answer the question. It only made the question harder to kill. Jacques de Molay died in 1314, and with him died the last public face of an order that had once seemed woven into the sacred machinery of Christendom. The Templars had guarded roads, held fortresses, managed wealth, buried brothers, received nobles, served popes, angered kings, and carried a cross that was both symbol and burden. Then, in the space of a few years, that same cross became evidence against them. That is the strange cruelty of their ending. The symbols that had made them powerful were turned inside out. Their secrecy became conspiracy. Their discipline became corruption. Their wealth became suspicion. Their independence became danger. Their initiation rites, whether distorted, exaggerated, locally abused, or partly real, became the center of a story from which they could not escape. And still, after all of it, the deepest accusation remains unproven. The surviving evidence does not clearly show that the Templars guarded a hidden church, a lost gospel, or a formal, forbidden Christianity passed down from Jerusalem in secret. The Grail, the bloodlines, the occult masters, the buried revelations beneath the Temple Mount. These belong more to later imagination than to the firmer ground of medieval documentation. But the opposite answer is not clean either. It is not enough to say they were simply innocent men destroyed by greed. Some testimony remains troubling, even when damaged by torture. Some internal customs may have been real, even if their meaning was twisted by prosecutors. Institutions with closed doors can develop shadows of their own. The Templars may have been victims of power, but victimhood does not automatically make every corner pure. What history gives us is more difficult. A religious military order whose real contradictions became fatal when a king learned how to weaponize them. They were not destroyed because a hidden gospel was proven. They were destroyed because enough people could be made to believe that something hidden existed, and because the order no longer had the political protection to survive that belief. That may be the real secret at the heart of the Templar fall. Not an object, not a code, not a doctrine whispered beneath Jerusalem. A reputation can be executed before a man is. By the time the flames rose around Jacques de Molay, the order had already been burned in the public mind. The legal distinctions, the papal hesitation, the absolutions, the uncertainty of the confessions. All of these mattered, but they could not fully compete with the image of a sacred brotherhood accused of betraying its own God in the dark. And that image endured because it was never fully resolved. Had the Templars been clearly proven guilty, the legend might have hardened into a warning. Had they been clearly vindicated, it might have become a story of injustice. Instead, they were suppressed, stained, and scattered. Their ending left just enough silence for later centuries to speak into it. So were they guardians of forbidden Christianity? Probably not in the way legend wants, but they did guard something the medieval world could no longer comfortably tolerate. A form of Christian authority that stood across borders, beyond ordinary royal command, wrapped in secrecy, armed with memory, and protected by vows older than the ambitions of any single king. That was dangerous enough. And perhaps it is why the story still draws us in. The Templars sit at the point where faith becomes power, power becomes fear, and fear becomes accusation. They remind us that history is not only shaped by what people do, it is shaped by what others can make the world believe they have done. The flames in Paris consumed the last Grand Master, but they did not consume the uncertainty. They left it behind, glowing faintly in the record, in the contradictions, in the space between confession and coercion, between heresy and politics, between the order that existed and the legend that refused to die. The Templars were likely not the proven keepers of a hidden Christianity, but the violence of their destruction made the world suspect that something had been buried with them. And sometimes, that is enough for a legend to outlive the truth.